today we're going to talk about a little more intermediate Python concepts. So in the last stream, I wanted to pick you up at the very beginning and just show you how programming can be fun and useful. And in this stream, we're going to go over, again, a project-centric type of working. It's the way that I like to learn and teach as well. So we're going to do something similar today. But the project is going to be how to auto-generate a website. And we're going to do this by picking content off the internet through APIs. So there's going to be an image that we're going to fetch with an API and also some text that we're going to get with an API, and then just piece it together using Python, like fetch it with Python, piece it together using Python, and then create a very simple HTML page. And I can actually give you a quick overview of what that will look like. Let me see where I have that. Okay, 1 second. So this is going to be what the pages are going to look like approximately. And we can play around with this a bit, but essentially it's just going to have, so in this project, when I prepared it, I just made a little Shipe website. So there's an API that gives you pictures of these dogs. And then these are just some famous, actual famous quotes, but I'm changing them a bit again, a little, just replacing short words with wow, so that it's actual Shipe speech. And then we're going to introduce a little random element that just pulls a random quote every time and pulls a random image every time. And then you can get just this very, it's just a very simple HTML with some text and an image on there. But the nice thing about it is going to be that you run your script and it's going to make one of those desktop, one of those, I just read in the comments, desktop, one of those sites. Yes, my desktop is very clean. Look at that. Beautiful. And I made a new folder in here, which is where we're going to keep the code for this session as well. Okay, so that's kind of what we're going to build. Maybe I'm going to use different images. There's also a cats one. Maybe you can vote on the chat. We can decide which types of images or which types of quotes you want to use. But I also want to drop in these 2 links into the chat again, in case you're interested in checking out our upcoming Twitch. There's not much going on there yet, but it will. And our, well, this is the wrong link, I think. Does that work? No. Channel link, your channel. There it is. Okay. So here's the link to the YouTube channel too. And also, if you want to check out our learning platform, here's the 3rd link. And that's all. And now, oh yeah, cool. I can do a quick introduction for anyone who's new. I'm Martin. I work at Coding Nomads. I do mentorship and content creation there. And I also wrote the Python at the Django course that's on our platform there. And I've got a bunch of experience teaching Python, and I like it. It's fun. And in this training, so we're going to go over this, what I just described, auto-generate a web page using API content from the web, and then just cobble it together, essentially using Python. And in this project, we're going to touch on a couple of interesting, concepts related to programming and Python specifically. So we're going to look at the package ecosystem that Python comes with, and how you can get a lot of functionality outside of the standard library, which is something we saw in the last stream. Also, how you can import the pathlib module from the standard library. And then there's a lot more that's out there, a code that other people wrote that you can get off of the internet. So we're going to talk a little about virtual environments, just to keep your development setting safe from other development settings that you might have on the same machine. Then we're going to talk about doing API interactions. So we're going to debunk a little what these APIs are and how you can get data that is offered on the internet pretty easily using Python and the requests library. Then I will talk a little bit about debugging, because that's a really important part of software development as well, that you always know how to inspect your code and figure out what's running and how you can find out what's going on, and if there's something going wrong, that you can debug it. And we will talk a little about some data types in Python, dictionaries and lists specifically, which are a very common type of collections that you will work with when you do stuff with Python. And it's especially common when you work with content that you get back from the web, because it is very often in JSON, and JSON can easily translate to either lists or dictionaries in Python. So we will look at those a bit, and also then just see how you can run this, how you can run a localhost server using Python to just serve these websites, even though we can also just open them in the browser like I did before. So maybe we just do that. And then because this is a little more because it's interfacing with the web, there's a couple of other technologies that we're gonna touch upon. So HTTP is something doing requests, getting content of the internet. This is something that works using HTTP requests. So we will talk about that just a tiny bit, and also HTML just a little, just enough in order to make these very simple web pages that you saw before. And yes, and JSON as the format that the data comes very often when you make an API request, and how Python handles that. All right, so that's all here. And let's dive right in. I'm gonna open up this folder. I made that yesterday. It just contains this one file that I wrote out yesterday. So there's nothing else in there so far. This was the little move script that made my desktop so nicely clean. And I'm gonna start off by just making a new, I am not recording, yes. Thanks for reminding me. Let me see where that is. Sorry about that. Just gotta hit the record button. Okay, thanks for reminding me. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so here we are in the editor, VS Code. I'm using the same one that you also saw yesterday. Same concepts. I'm not going to go over it again, but if you're interested to learn more about it and you haven't been there yesterday, then go check out the previous video. I think I already have it up on YouTube, or otherwise it's going to go live soon. All right, and now I'm going to make this new file in here. I'm just going to call it website.py. Again, .py is important so that my system knows it's a Python file. Okay, let me just get organized here for a second. Good. So let's start off again with some pseudocode, just giving some ideas of what we really need to do, so that then we can build out these different pieces of code. Part one is going to be, we're going to need some library in order to be able to make this web request. So get the tools for doing web requests is what I'm going to call it. And feel free to give me some input on what you think the steps are that we need in order to get this done. Like you saw the website that I want to build, and we want to fetch some content, right? So if you have any input, just shoot it in the chat. I can see the chat over here. All right, so we get the tools for web requests. It's going to be the requests library. So I might have to install it first, make this virtual environment. So put this up here as well. Make a virtual environment. Install requests. This is essentially the same thing. Get the tools, or we can call this one import the tools. Cool. Okay, and then as I said, I want to get an image, and I also want to get a quote. So I need to know two APIs to interact with. So I need an image API, and I need a quotes API. And I already looked those up, so I have the links hanging around here. I'm gonna put them here on this. No, that's the wrong link. Copy, okay. There it is. So this is the Shipe API that has the pictures of the cute dogs. And then there's another one that I found. That has some quotes. It's going to be at this URL. And also before we're going to start working with those, one thing that you always want to do is inspect those APIs. Like you want to know what you're working with, because unless like every API has different ways of specific, like how it's set up, what data you can get and how you can get it. So if you want to interact with it, you're always going to have to check out the documentation of that specific API. Okay, so then I want to get the image, get image and quote. And then we're probably going to do a little bit of inspecting of the data, but then, I don't know, like next step, let's say, create a new file, create HTML structure, and that would be it. Or write to the file, maybe that's a separate step. Let's see. So this is just, again, like yesterday, just a very rough outline of what is approximately that I want to do inside of in this project. And this makes it much easier for me to just follow the individual steps and just work it out while I'm working on it. Okay, so I'm going to start off with the first part, which is creating a virtual environment and then installing the requests library. So you might already be familiar with virtual environments, but in case you're not, they are a way to keep your development environment separate from the rest of your computer. So you can, in Python, you can pretty easily make them by just typing the command python 3-m vnv. That's the command. And then you can give it a name as well. So I usually just call it vnv as well. And when I run this command, you see that here in my folder structure, a new folder pops up. And you can inspect that folder. It has a bunch of stuff in there. You see that there's like the Python program is in there. And there's a couple of libraries that come with it already. So it's essentially your separated packaged Python installation that you can work with, and I can install other packages that are not part of the standard library into this version of the development environment that I have, so that I don't have it on my whole system. This is important when you do any sort of web development, because often you might be working with different versions of a framework, for example, and you can't have multiple versions of it installed system-wide. So you want to always compartmentalize this for each project that you're working on. This is what virtual environments are very useful for. And just creating it is not enough. So you also need to activate it. So once I created it, I can say source, then the name of the virtual environment. And again, I'm using the tab character to just make sure that it auto-completes correctly. And then I need to go into the bin folder and then run the activate script. So when I do this, I've sourced this activate script. You're going to see there's a change here on the side of my prompt. Now I get the name of my virtual environment pop up here. And as soon as you see this, you know that everything's fine. You're inside of your virtual environment. Anything that you're going to install is just going to stick within there. And if you would just go and delete this folder, everything's gone. So that's always good for this type of development. Okay, so we made the virtual environment. Now, next thing is going to install requests, which is a very popular Python library that is not part of the standard library, but it's extremely common that people who work with the web would use this library. So you can go and install this using pip install and then the name of the library, requests with an S at the end. And this fetches the package from something called PyPI, the Python package index, where there's a ton of different packages on there. And you can publish packages to this place as well, and then people can install it with this pip install. So also a little word of warning, you don't just want to install anything with pip install, because there's no sorts of security checks in there. And you might install some malicious software, potentially like a Python code that could do something malicious on your system. So you just want to install packages that you know that they are actually a stable and a safe package to use. And with requests, that's definitely the case. Okay, we got that done. Make a VNV, install requests. Cool. There's no code associated to this, but now we're starting with some Python code inside of the script here. So I want to import the tools for doing web requests. All right, so I'm going to import requests. And because I will be running this inside of my virtual environment, it's going to have access to requests to this library that I wouldn't have access to otherwise. All right, let's try. I can run it, and it should usually not have any problems executing. Even though you see again, like this is just code comments, so it's not going to do anything. There you go. It ran, no error. No error is always fine. That means everything's going as expected so far. Okay, so now we're at the point where it's time to take a look at the two different APIs. You see VS Code has a nice follow link, so I can just hover over this and click on this. on this prompt that says follow link, and then on open, and it's going to open this page for me. All right, this is the API. I don't know who of you already worked with APIs, but this might seem a little confusing if it's the first time that you hear anything about it. So what are APIs in the first place might be a question that's coming up, because this doesn't look like a great website. And let's take a look. Often an API like this also has just a normal site associated with it that is more front-end focused. So has this one. And let's read over this. So shipe.online gives you as an API for dog pictures, and it tells you how to use the API. So this is a pretty simple API, and all it does is really just return you pictures of dogs. But there's all sorts of APIs, and every bigger project out there basically has APIs. Like Twitter has APIs, Google has APIs, etc., etc. And you can do all sorts of things with this programmatically. That's really also the point of what an API is about. It stands for Application Programming Interface. And the idea is that you can build programs around it that interact with content that is offered by other programs. So it gives you a way to make programs interact with each other, essentially. You can write code for doing this. And this is exactly what we're going to do as well. Our Python script is going to interact with a program that sits up there in the web in actually 2 different places. And it's going to ask them for some content, receive the content, and then do something with it. It's the basic idea of APIs. And if you think this, once you kind of like understand that there's so much content out there on the internet, and a lot of those actually even have APIs, this just opens up a whole world of opportunities of doing things by like consuming data and repurposing that data, putting it together with some other data, creating something new out of it, etc. So having some handle on using APIs is something that gives you a lot of reach and a lot of opportunities. So that's also why I wanted to make this second stream about that and show you how it's relatively easy to do this with Python. Okay, with each API comes an API documentation. If it's a good API, that is. If it's a bad one, then you might end up having to figure out stuff for yourself, which is always a bit hard. But if it's a good one, then you get some documentation, and this one has it. So it explains to me when I read this, I can make a GET request, an HTTP GET request. This is the question that I'm asking to their server. I'm like, I want to get, and then I want to get a picture of a shipe. How many? You have this option to say, I want 1 up to 100. I want to get the URLs or HTTPS URLs. There's like some additional options. Now, if just looking at this, maybe count makes sense right away. These things, if you read this for the first time, you might not know what it's about. But there's explanations further down. That's the nice thing about all of this documentation. Okay, so you'll get back a JSON response. So here is the second word that I mentioned earlier. We had HTTP GET requests. This an HTTP request. It doesn't actually say the word here, but the GET request here is an HTTP GET request. And you'll get back a JSON response. This is very common when you're working with APIs, that the response comes back as a JSON object. This stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and it's similar to JavaScript code. But really, all you have to think about, if you have some experience with Python, it's very similar to a list or a dictionary, depending on how it's set up, or a list of dictionaries. Let's say it's most common to a dictionary, and similar to, it can be a list of dictionaries. So this is what you're going to get back, and we're going to look at lists and dictionaries in just a bit. This is what you're going to get back. Image URL 1, 2, how many you requested. You can define how many you want. And now we have explanations of these other options, URLs, true, false. This is whether the API should return URLs or file names without extensions. And it also tells us that the URLs are the default. So if I don't specify anything, then I'm going to get URLs. And also whether they should come or HTTPS or HTTP. And HTTPS is the default. And then you can get pictures like this. Okay. So this one is actually a little harder to try out. No, we're gonna get the URL, so it's fine. Okay, so let's give it a spin. We get HTTPS, so this is going to be interesting. I will copy this and then go back to Visual Studio Code. what we just did is inspecting this API. Yeah. And now I can make a request to this API to get back an image. Just read about how I can do this, and let's see if we can also implement it in here. So I want to get an image. URL is what it told us that we're going to get. And for now, I'm just pasting in the URL that I copied from over there. And let's see what I need from this. You might, so if you're not at all familiar with URLs, then you might think that this square brackets could be part of it. But this, in this case, this just means you have to choose something in here. So it's either or. You don't actually want those square brackets to be part of it. So in our case here, I want one URL only, and all of these other things where I can select true or false, I'm just going to go with the defaults. So I don't need to put anything in there. So I'm going to make a request to shipes.online/API/shipes and count 1. And that's an image URL that I want to get. Before running this in here in Python, I'm going to go back to the browser and pop this over here. And you see, that's the result that I get. So I get a list that contains one URL, a string, that points to an image of a dog somewhere on the internet. I can take a look at this as well. And there's the image. So this is a random image of a dog on the internet. Hi, Alex is asking what we installed with pip in order to import requests. Well, so we just installed pip install requests. So the exact same name that you're also importing. That's usually the case. That's the package name, and then that's the package name that you import. All right. So now this response makes a little more sense when you look at it, right? It is actually this link that points to a specific image resource out there on the web. And in this case, that's the image. If I reload this, which just means making another GET request, only now I'm making it with my browser, then I get a different, wait, did this run now? I was just looking somewhere else. Yeah, okay, so then I get a different URL in here. And when I look at that one, you see that it's a different dog. So it just always picks a random image, a random URL to a random image. Okay, wait, here we have another question here. Is there a prerequisite required to create the virtual environment? Mine didn't work, but I just kept going for this example. Okay, yeah, so it's not a big deal if you install requests, the library system-wide, because it's something that if you're working with Python, you're actually going to use it quite a lot. I generally advise against installing external libraries outside of virtual environments, but with requests, you can make an exception because it's so commonly used and also very stable. There's not really a prerequisite. As long as you have Python 3 on your system, you should be able to run it with this command that goes, I'm just going to type it out here once again. If you say Python 3, this is just to be explicit that you want to use Python 3. For me, it's mapped to Python also, so it would do the same thing. But then you would say, sorry, Python 3-m, this stands for module. So you want to use a module, and the module is called VNV. And so if you have some Python 3 installation, then that's already part of it. And then you give it a name. So that's the command for this. Okay. Back to the cute dogs. Yes, so you see that that's a response, and I can make this GET request as I just did. I can make it with my browser. You can really think of your browser as a tool for making GET requests. That's what it is. You make requests to specific resources somewhere out on the internet, and then you get a response from the server. That's exactly what's happening here. I'm making a request to this very specific location with some parameters that I'm passing. In this case, I'm only passing one, saying I only want one URL back. And that's what I get. Since this is an API, it's designed to be consumed by a program. So it's not very pretty. All I get is some text. But the text is in a very specific format, which is JSON, which makes it easy to be consumed by other programs. Now, there's other stuff, like, for example, this one, the image or the official site, which has some HTML structure behind it because it's designed to be looked at and understood by reading it by a human rather than a program. But if I go to this URL and I press enter with my browser, it does a very similar thing. It also makes the HTTP request to a GET request to the server. It's probably sitting on the same server as this one, right? And returns the response to me. Only the response is a little different. So that's what these HTTP requests are about. And you can see you can do them with your browser. And now let's do them with Python instead. We have the same URL in here. Now you already know what it does. It gives a random URL of a dog in this case. And now in order to get that URL, I can say requests. I'm using this library that I imported up here. So very similar to the pathlib that we did yesterday, only that I installed requests from the internet rather than that it came already with the Python installation. And the method on here is get. So I can say requests.get, and then I just need to pass in this image URL. All right, that's really all. So if I do this, then let's print it out, the result, and run the script, then Python's going to do what I did before with my browser. Python's going to make the, oh, wait, I might have messed this up because I still have the Python 3, just a second. Okay, let's try this again. I don't want this, and I just want to run my script. Okay, so what I get back is response 200, and there's a couple of HTTP response codes. The 200 one, if you get that one back ever, you can be happy because that means that your request was successful and you got something back. It's not really what you were looking for, maybe, right? If you're thinking of, okay, I actually want to see this URL or expecting this URL to pop up, but what really pops up is just this message here saying response 200, which, yeah, it's actually a good sign, but it might not really seem very satisfying. So this is, again, you're dealing again with an object, and we're going to talk more about objects tomorrow in the next session, where it's all about object-oriented programming. But in this case, it just means that a part of the object that you get returned is going to be the URL, but there's also other things on there. One of the other things that's on there is a response, like what type of response you got. And you can be more specific about these things. So again, I make this dot here, and it shows me, VS Code shows me a bunch of stuff that this object has available, a bunch of things I can do with it, right? So for example, there should be a response one somewhere. Let me see. Our status, I think it's what it's called. Status code, there it is. So if I explicitly just want to see this one attribute of the object that I'm getting returned here, then I can do this image.chat, and this is just going to tell me 200 now. Oh, there it is already. And every time that I run this script, it makes this HTTP request. Python asks the browser for a response and gets the response. Not the browser, sorry, asks the server for a response and gets the response. Cool. Okay, so we don't want that status code, but instead something else. Let's see what else is offered in here. You've got something called text. That sounds interesting. Maybe there's a URL, could be something, but there's also a method on it that's called JSON. There it is. And this one, I think it's a method, or maybe it's an attribute. We can try it out. Converts the response that it gets into something. Okay, yeah, see, so it's a method. So I need to call it. And then it's going to convert the response that it gets in JSON into something that Python can work with. Show you this one more time in that way. So we have the output sitting here. And this looks the same as what you got back here, right? Okay. Alex is asking something about, what's the question about the virtual environment? Yeah, I'm not sure about that right now. I'm not gonna dive too deeply into virtual environments, but Python 3 is not recognized. It might depend on what operating system you're working on. and how you have Python set up. So the thing at the beginning, that's either Python 3 or py, that just is a reference to the Python program wherever you have it installed. And so whichever one you have set up as the shortcut to there, this is the one that's going to work. Okay, so one thing you might have noticed with this whole print thing that I'm doing here is that every time now I want to see anything new about this returned object, the image, I have to run the whole script again, which means making the request again, etc., etc. So instead of doing that, I want to introduce you to debugging approach with breakpoint. And in Python, this is easily done up from, I think, 3.6 upwards, Python 3.6 upwards. You can use this, or maybe it's 3.7, not sure. This function in here called just breakpoint, and you need to call it. Wherever you put it inside of your script, it's going to stop execution at this point, and you will have access to whatever happened before, and you can play around with it a bit. So let's give that a try. I press play on this. I'm going to make one more request. And then here, the execution stops. So this is at this point. We don't have anything printed out yet. It's pointing me here. It's telling me, okay, this is going to be the next line of code that will execute, but it didn't execute yet. So what's the point of this? I get a chance to play around with what has already been defined in here. So I can say image. And in the same way that before running the script once, I got this output. I could say image.status code 200. You see, and now I don't need to make these requests again, but I just get a chance to inspect this object some more. So I can say image.json. And you might already notice that this is somewhat similar to the interpreter and that we looked at yesterday. If you want to do some sort of figuring stuff out quickly, that is not necessarily part of the script that you're building, but you just need to understand something about the data that you're working with, or just remember maybe a method name that you forgot. You can try it out in here in the debugger. And then once you got it figured out, you can move back to your code and fixate it, so to say, by an actual line of code. So what's interesting here is, let's see, this is what type is this thing here that we're getting returned that we're working with. Okay, so you see this is a list. So in Python, lists are a very common data structure, and they are introduced by these square brackets. So anything that's surrounded by square brackets in Python is a list, and the list can have many items. In this case here, it only has one item, which is this one long string of a URL, but there could be more. So you could have a couple of, let me actually make a new, where we can go into the Python interpreter. So I could make a list. I'm going to call it my list with square brackets, and then I can give it some content. For example, here I make a list that contains 3 numbers. Print it out, and you see it has the same syntax structure of the square brackets and then items in there. And the different items are separated by numbers. So this list has 3 items in it, okay? These items don't have to be numbers, they can be strings. You don't want to use just the word list if you play around with stuff like that, because that's actually a somewhat reserved thing inside of Python. But if you want to use something and you're not too creative, then you can always put an underscore at the end. It's kind of like the standard for doing this. Okay, so I can have strings in here as well. So A, B, and even a mix of items. So I can also have 2 strings and a number in here. There's really no limit to what you put inside of a Python list. You can grow this list, you can shrink it, you can access specific items of that list. But yeah, so there's a bunch of things you can do with it. What might be interesting in our case. All right, let's go back project oriented, which is the right one. No. So it should be here. Okay. So this is back in the code. Now, this is a list, right? But I can't really do anything with the list. I need really just the one item from this list. So I need to get it out of there. And there's different ways of doing this, but what's the best way to do it? You could use, for example, list method, similar to the string methods we looked at. I could say list.pop, and this would get me the last item and return it. That would be a way of doing it. So now the list is one item shorter because I popped that one out, and because I didn't assign it to anything, it just went into nowhere. So that's a way to do it. Or you could access it by the index. So I could say, give me the first item by saying list 0. In Python, a lot of stuff is 0 indexed. So like this, I could pick out A. In that case, that did not change the list. So the list is, whoops, gotta use the same capitalization. Yeah. So the list is still the same, but I can access the first item of the list like this. So both of these ways could work. In the case over there, I'm just gonna probably, let's try it out. Image.json, this gives a list, and then I can say .pop. And here I have access to the actual string that is the URL. And this is what you're going to need if you want to include it somewhere in a website, right? You need the actual URL to the image. In the same way that this doesn't show you what type of dog this is, or you don't see anything in this image, but you need to have the specific URL by itself, not inside of a list or whatever. Wait, we have a question. Let me just pull in the chat for a second. Okay, so hi, try using PyCharm. It sets up the VNV automatically for you. Yes, so there's other IDEs and text editors, for example, PyCharm, that do some of this virtual environment stuff automatically for you. There's also some tricks in there, and I've had a couple of students that got pretty confused with PyCharm. So I'm suggesting people to use VNV and just to use VS Code and just run this one line to make the virtual environment. But PyCharm is a great IDE as well. It's very complex, but there's a ton of stuff you can do. So if you're a little more advanced, it's definitely something to look into. And then we have another comment. I was playing around and I tried to do length image text and I got 80, but when I do length image JSON, it is 1. Image text looks like it's also a list with 1 item, so why was the output 80 for it? Let's take a look. I don't know off the top of my head, but let's look it up. Image.text. What is that? Okay, so this looks to be a string, and you can always test that by using the type function here. So image.text. Okay, so you see that this is a string, while type image.json, what this method call returns, is a list. This text thing here looks exactly the same as you said, but it's not an object to work with, right? It's just a string. So I couldn't. I could do string manipulation. I could cut off this beginning square bracket, right, and the end square bracket. Again, like we said yesterday, also there's a ton of different ways of doing things, right? But you want to stay with something that's a little more clean and sticks with. Yeah. So imagine, think about it like this. Imagine that you have a couple of responses, not just one URL. Okay. So if you would say count 2 in here, all right, let's try it out. Why not? To drive this point home. So now I'm changing the count here. I'm making a different request, and I'm going to get 2 URLs back inside of this list. Yeah, I'm going to stop again at breakpoint here. All right, here we are. I should have access to image.json. Here it is. You see there's 2 URLs in here now. And image.text should give us again the same thing as 1 string, right? So the length of, the length of image.text is going to be 1. Oh, no, it's actually, sorry, it gives, because strings are collections as well, so it counts how many characters are inside of this one long string, right? So length of image text is every single character, which is not really what you want to work with in here, right? You want to think of these different URLs as individual units, not of each character in there as an individual unit. To make things more confusing, because you want to deal with one URL and then maybe another URL. So the length of image.json is going to be 2, because it's a list that contains 2 string URLs. And this gives you the chance to pick them out separately. So I can say, give me the first item of image.json, and I get this URL, or I can say, give me the second one, and I get the other one. It's a little hard to see, but if you look at these hashes here, you see that they're different images. The way of doing this with the text would be very difficult, because you'd have to do some sort of parsing of the text to figure out where does it split up, and then cut off parts here, et cetera, et cetera. So it just makes it more complicated. All right, I hope that makes sense. But yeah, so a way of doing this, we could also, just to make sure that we always just pick the first one, I could just do this. Okay, I want to get the first item, then it doesn't matter how many I request, but I really just need one. So that's what I'm going to stay with. Okay, let's rewind a little and get back into this script here. All right, so we did the VNV, we installed requests, imported the tools for requests, import requests, talked a lot about APIs and API documentation, that you got to read over this, and then popped in this URL as per the description on the website, how you can receive one URL. Then we made the call using Python, first through the browser, then using Python, and now using some debugging tool called breakpoint that just stops the execution at a certain point and allows you to play around with it with your script, with your code at that specific point, essentially. We figured out that we need to get the first item of this response here. Now, I can keep chaining this here to the end. So I can say requests.get image URL, you know what gets returned here is going to be, let's look at the single one. No, it's not here anymore. So it's going to be a list, or it's going to be an object. It's going to be a response object that has a method on it called .json that you can call. So by doing this, I call this method on this object. And then from this, from what gets returned from this method, which is a list of strings, right? A list of strings here. Well, that's actually the string of, that's just the one string. So our list is here. Yeah, that's what gets returned. I'm picking out the first item, which is this string. And I'm doing this here with the indexing of 0. And that's the string, that's the URL to the specific image that I want to assign to. So that's where I'm putting it. Okay, I see I'm going a little slow here, so I want to speed up. But this breakpoint part for debugging is something that if you're a little familiar already with programming and you want to take the next step, then I would suggest to look a little into debugging. And this breakpoint is like a really nice addition to the Python language that came relatively recently and makes it, there were other ways to do it before, but this one makes it very easy. And then, yeah, I encourage you to play around with the different states of your program, essentially, wherever you are. Cool. Okay, but we have more to do. So I'm going to comment this out for now and look at the next task. We have access to the image URL now. The next thing that I wanted to get is a quote. So there's another API here. Let's see what this one does. So they have, again, you want to, this is big. Again, you want to go and read the documentation of this API to figure out how does it even work. Okay, that's a bit better. So this is how it looks like on the front end. So it seems like it gives you some sort of quotes, right? And the API gives it more in a format that's going to be easier to consume by a program. Same thing as before. And you can find the description of how you can run it also on this, on here. Probably that's I assume that's the API description. Yeah, there you go. So here's the, you can get a full list by running this request. You get a bunch of them, popular ones, single one, or a random one. And we're going to stick with this one, which just every time I call it, similar to the image before, it's going to give me a different quote. Okay, cool. So that's the URL. And I can do the same thing over there. No. I can say quote URL. Or actually, I'm not really getting a, no, yeah, I'm defining the quote URL here, which is this random.json. And then I want, we already did some inspecting. I'm going to get rid of this to clean it up a little. Get image and quote. So here we get the image. And then we can get the quote in the same way. So quote URL. Oops. Image URL, get the image, quote URL, get the quote. So I'm going to say quote equals requests.get quote URL. Okay, so, but again, you know, this is going to be an object. So we can already say, yeah, we want to do this JSON thing again. Yeah. But then it's a little difficult to know what exactly should you get here now, right? This is, I don't know, it might be a little overwhelming to read out where exactly is the text. So I'm going to hop into a debugger session again after making this call so we can play around with this object a little more. So I run this. And it looks like I got a syntax. So I think the problem is that I didn't exit the interpreter first. Let's try it again. Okay, it stops here. And now I have an option to inspect this new quote thing that was just made. Looks like we got, by random chance, the same quote as here, ID 14. Maybe there's not that many on there. And so if you're already a bit familiar with Python, you might know. If not, what type of object is this? This is not a list. Instead, that's a dictionary. So Python dictionaries are also extremely common, and they're very related to JSON as well. This is like how JSON essentially gets represented very often. Either it's a list, as you saw before, or otherwise it's going to be a dictionary. And the dictionary gives you the option to access specific pieces of information inside. So I can find out who's the author and just get the author out of this dictionary, or what ID does this quote have, or, which is what we're interested in, get the text of the quote, or there's also the option to get the link. But in this case, we actually want the text. We don't want to link anywhere else. And the way to do this in Python is I can say quote and then put this square brackets. So it's similar to indexing with lists, but instead of putting a number in here for the index, you put in the name of the key. So a dictionary exists of these keys, and then you see there's a colon, and then there's a variable to it, and then there's another key, and then another variable to it. And I can access the variables through the keys. So if I say quote in this case, so this is just called quote because I named it like that, and this is called quote because inside of the response, that's the name, that's the key of the dictionary. And like that, I get out the string that I want. Okay, so there's play around with these dictionaries. It's a fun thing to find out some more about how they work, but for the sake of time, I'm gonna move on, and with having figured out how we can get to specifically the string that you want here, which is essentially just putting this lookup, this dictionary lookup at the end. So I'm gonna get the dictionary returned here by calling this JSON method on it, and then I'm just picking out the specific quote. All right, so now, next thing that you need is to save it somewhere. We need a file for where to save this content, or maybe first we want to create the HTML structure actually. So let's do that before. Move this afterwards. Okay. To create the HTML structure, I'm not going to build really proper HTML site here at the moment because that would just take too much time. But the good thing about modern browsers is that if you have a somewhat messy HTML structure, it's going to autocomplete the missing pieces. As long as there's nothing really wrong with it, it can do that. So we don't need to write a ton of HTML to get this site to work. So I'm just going to say HTML equals, and then this, it depends on how familiar you are with HTML, but it works like this. If you want to display an image on a page, you give it a tag called img. You open up a tag in HTML like this. Let me actually show you this quick so we have that time. A tag in general in HTML looks like that you have opening and closing angular brackets to open up a tag, and then a slash and opening closing brackets to close it again. And this P here says it's a paragraph, but this could be other things. So it could be a div, or it could be, I don't know, there's a ton of them, EM or strong. There's really a ton of different HTML tags, but they all follow the same structure, that you have an opening tag and a closing tag, and then in between here comes the content. So this would be the text for the paragraph. Managed. So this is what you want to build up here as well. We want a text for a paragraph. Actually, this is what we want. Let's start off with that before dealing with the image. So the text for the paragraph should not be text for the paragraph, but what it should be is this quote. Okay, so how to get this in there? There's a nice way to do this. There's a couple of ways of string formatting in Python, but one that's been also introduced with 3.6 is called f strings. And it works by putting this f in front of the opening quotes of your string. And then you can use curly braces. You see that VS Code nicely formats them for me too. And then I can just put a variable in here. So I can say quote in here. And that just is gonna it's gonna interject the string or whatever variable I have in here and just make it part of this one string. So if I'm gonna run this and print out HTML, it will give me the opening and closing p tag, and then in between the random quote that it fetched from the internet. Let's give this a try. Breakpoint is off. There you go. So now we got a different quote, and you see it's just the text of the quote. It's wrapped inside of p tags. So that's what you want, because you want to create some sort of HTML structure for the website. Okay, so that's part one. And then the second thing that you want to get in here is the image. The image, again, has a different tag. So I will put it in here. And it goes like this, that you say image source, and then you need quotes. And inside of these quotes goes the URL of the image that you want to display, which in our case here is inside of this image variable. That's where we got it and saved it to. So I can open up, again, these curly braces and then interject this variable. And then I need to close the tag. Now, I just told you before that all HTML tags look like this: opening tag, closing tag. The image tag is a little different. It actually does everything inside of the opening tag, so you don't need a closing tag for this one. It's more an exception. Most of them work like the p tag. Okay, so that's a different string. Let's run this one again. And here you go. If Java had true garbage collection, most programs would delete themselves upon execution. Little jab at Java, sorry about that. And then you see the P is closed, and afterwards you get the image URL. So this is the text that would make up the website. You got everything that you need, essentially. It's not a good HTML structure. And if you want to know more about HTML, you should definitely learn something about it. If you do any sort of web development, you will need to know some more HTML than this. But this is the very basics, and it's going to work. It's going to produce these types of sites that we saw at the beginning. But what we still need to do for that is not print it out, but instead create a new file and then write the content to this file. And to do this, we're going to bring back something from yesterday. I'm going to say from pathlib, import path. So I'm getting this path object again from the standard library. You don't need to install anything here. And I will create a new file. I'm going to say path the same way as before. I'm going to say, let's put it on the desktop. So home.join path on the desktop. And then from here, I can give it a name. And then whatever we want to call it, let's say this is I'm just going to call it index.html. It's an HTML page that I want to build. So I'm creating this file like that. I'm going to say this path is going to be my file. And then I need to write my content to this file. So instead of printing it out like we do here, right? This is what I want to do, but instead of printing it to the console, I want to print it out to the file. So I'm going to say file.write text. You see there's this autocomplete that helps me to make this things go faster. And now I can just put the HTML that we defined up here and interject that the quote and the image source in there. So I can say f.file. This is the file that I created. I'm going to create it on the desktop directly and call it index.html. Or actually, let's put it inside of the folder here. So that's going to be, you can see it pop up as well. So I'm going to put another join path. And I'm just going to spell it right. Python-days, I believe is what I called it. Double check on that. Python-days, there it is. So I'm going to make it appear inside of this folder so you can see it right away. Okay, no need to print this. We're just writing to a file. And now when I'm going to go and press this play button up here, it's going to do the necessary imports. It's going to make 2 requests to 2 different APIs. One, this image API, and one, this quotes API. It's going to do the request here, pick out from the request, like convert it to an object from JSON to a Python object that Python can work with. Pick out, in this case, the first item only consists of this one image URL. And then here, we're going to also convert it to JSON and then pick out from a Python dictionary the key, like the value that is associated with the quote key. We're storing these 2 in variables and then building one big string using an F string where we interject this quote into a P tag and then interject the image into the source of that's an image HTML element. Then we're creating a new file object, or more specifically, the path to a new file object. And here I'm going to actually create the object and write the content, this string, into the file. All right, let's see. When I run this, it should pop up here. Over there, you should see it pop up. And then here it is. So now we have index.html sitting in here. Look very when we look at it like this. But you see it's similar to the print output before. It just has a P tag with some text in there, and then it has an image. Now, when I go ahead and open this up in the browser, I can just double click this. Then we should have, there it is. It just was very big. So now we have this random quote from this first API, and then a random dog picture from this other API. And the nice thing is, if I would go ahead and run this script now another time, you will see that the content changes because it fetches 2 new random things and builds them into the same, so this is changed now. If I go back to my browser and reload this, you see there's a different image and a different quote up here. All right, so I also still wanted to show you how you can change some of the text. As I did in the example, you could go in here and you have the full quote text sitting right here, right? So you could just go ahead and change this by, for example, I'm going to show you a quick one. Instead of doing lowercase, I'm just going to uppercase everything that's in this quote. And you can do any sorts of string manipulation to this. Replace specific words of it, pick them out, throw them away, take only every second word, whatever you want to do, right? This is something you could do in this part of your script. You could play with the string and change it. And then later you would input it into the site, right? And then you could do things to the image. You could say, restrict the size of the image. The first one that we saw was huge image, right? This is all HTML. This is all stuff that you can do with HTML directly. So I could say width equals 300. So this is the maximum width then it's going to have. Yeah, and then you can run this. And every time you run it and reload, you will get, now in this case, it's uppercase, right? You can also change it here. Now I'm just playing around, but we're pretty much out of time. So I'm changing this to a heading, and then it's going to be much bigger. The text is going to be much bigger. Reload this. There you go. Now I got a very, very loud screaming black quote and a tiny dog sitting on here. Okay, so we're done with our time, and I want to wrap this up. And we got to the final product pretty much. It looks very similar to what I showed you at the beginning. It's a site, a very simple HTML site that uses the content from different places on the internet, pulls it using APIs, and then assembles it inside of your Python script to create something new, essentially. And same as yesterday, you can see that you don't need a ton of code for doing this type of stuff with Python. And that's what is one of the powerful things about Python, is that it's the way that you can write with it is very intuitive. It's similar to your language requests.get the URL, get the JSON from it. And then, yes, there's a bit of syntax to learn, but that's just learning a new language in general. But you can do a lot of stuff with not a lot of code. And this is one thing that I like about Python, and it opens, and using some APIs really opens up your creativity to play with the data that's out there in the internet, and yeah, make something fun. Try using this similar script and try to, I don't know, maybe change something about the text. That might be an easy way to start, or actually make a nice HTML website out of it that changes the image every time you run the script, something like that. Okay. Are there any questions for the stuff that I went over so far? Anything you want to maybe still discuss? What do we see in the chat? Playing around. I read using type more often. Yeah, type is a very, very helpful function to figure out what's the data type that you're currently working with. Yeah, definitely worth it. Cool. Well, thanks for joining. Again, if you're interested to learn more, you get the links at the beginning of the chat. We have free content on our platform, and feel free to also check out the YouTube channel. There's a bunch of videos already on there. We're going to upload this one as well in just a bit. And yeah, check out the learning platform. There's a ton of content on there. I can recommend the stuff that's there. And yeah, thanks for joining. This was Intermediate Python, how to auto-generate a web page and using remote API content. And tomorrow, if you join at the same time, I'm going to talk about using Python as an object-oriented programming language, which we already did in this past 2 days. But now we're going to dive a little deeper into what objects are and how you can create your own objects. And we're going to do that by making a tiny Pokemon game. So I hope you like that, and see you tomorrow.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please let us know by liking and subscribing. If there's another topic that you'd like to learn more about, leave us a comment. We would love to hear from you. And if you want to become a coding pro, visit our website at codingnomads.co. See you next time.